Hello everyone, and welcome to the 6th episode of the Return of SKULLTRAIL series. In the previous episode I added more cooling to the system before turning up the settings, overclocking the RAM and both CPUs, reaching as high as 4.2 GHz. I also made some predictions as to what the gaming performance would be like. Today I'll finally be testing the system in a variety of games to assess its performance and to see if my predictions were correct. For those of you who have not been following along, here is a small summary of the system. We have an Intel D5400XS SKULLTRAIL motherboard with two Intel Core 2 Quad QX9775 unlocked CPUs, cooled by two Galit Tranquilo Rev4 CPU coolers, 16 GB of quad channel FBDDR2 overclocked to 800 MHz at CL5 settings, a Corsair RM1000X power supply, a standard 320 GB hard drive at 7200 RPM, and for the GPU I will be using a Gigabyte Windforce GTX 1060 6GB. Besides simply being curious to see what a unique system of this age can do in games, I also would like to find out a few other things. Firstly, back when this platform was released in 2008, many of the reviewers were impressed by its performance in multi-core applications. However, in the games they tested, this system was performing equal to, if not worse, compared to standard quad-core or even dual-core systems. Obviously, the games tested back then were not optimized for more than 4 or even 2 cores, so I'd like to see if this has changed now. It better have. To do so, I've tested using a couple configurations. First, using only one QX9775 CPU, overclocked to 3.95 GHz, to represent what a single quad-core can do. For the sake of convenience, I've rounded up 3.95 to 4 GHz in the chart, just so you know. Next, using two CPUs at stock speed, which is 3.2 GHz, to compare if more cores at a lower clock speed is better than fewer cores at a higher clock. And next, I'm also of course curious to which extent overclocking both CPUs makes a difference. So I've also tested both clocked at 3.95 GHz. For the sake of reference, I've also included my own Sandy Bridge Core i7 2600K, clocked at 4.3 GHz, to get an idea of how the system compares to a modern 4-core 8-thread CPU with high single-thread performance. As mentioned briefly in the beginning, to do my testing I've used a Gigabyte Windforce GTX 1060 6GB, and all the testing for the games have been run at 1080p. Without further ado, let's get to the results. Starting with Battlefield 1, I tested the first campaign level at ultra settings. Here you can see some big differences. The single quad core scored a playable 40 FPS, but the 22 FPS 1% low could be felt from time to time. Moving to the dual CPU at stock speed, it gained an impressive 28% to an average of 51 FPS. Looking at the dual overclocked chip, the average rose to the desirable 60 FPS mark. An impressive 50% uplift from the single chip and improving 18% over stock. The 2600K was 43% ahead still, scoring an 86 FPS average. Moving on to Dirt Rally, I ran the in-game benchmark using the ultra quality settings, with interesting results, as both the single overclocked CPU and dual stock CPUs scored a perfect 60 FPS average, with 40 FPS on the 1% low. Overclocking both chips increased performance by 8% to 65. All were very playable, but still a good way behind the 2600K, which averaged 104 FPS, being a 60% lead. No benchmark suite is complete without Crysis, so here I have tested Crysis 3 at the infamously intensive grass level of the first mission, using the very high preset. Here there are very big differences. The single 9775 CPU scored only 35 FPS, and was not a smooth experience at all, reflected by the 13 FPS 1% low. This was definitely too intensive for a single core 2 quad. Going to the stock 8 core setup saw a big jump, gaining 46% to a more playable 51 FPS, with the average of 25 for the 1% low being a much smoother experience. Increasing clock speed gained another 10% to 56 FPS average. It was 16% faster than a single quad core. With a 29 FPS 1% low, this was even smoother. The Sandy Bridge i7 was another 25% ahead, scoring a 70 FPS average. Now to the immensely popular Fortnite. I played a solo match with 100 players, using the epic quality preset, and recorded FPS in various locations of the map to get an average. Here all CPUs are fairly close together. The single quad core scored 68 FPS, with a average 43 FPS for the 1% low. Moving to the stock 8 core, we saw a small improvement of 6% to 72, with the 1% low improved by 5 FPS. Overclocking helped another 10% to 79 FPS, which was 16% faster than the single CPU, and with a 1% low of 59, it was a very smooth experience and was only 14% behind the 2600K, which averaged 90 FPS. Things were rather interesting in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, where I tested a match of Team Deathmatch on the revamped Dust 2 map, using the high settings. Here there were barely any differences between all of SKULLTRAIL's configurations, showing very little scaling when going from 4 to 8 cores, with the dual overclocked CPU only being 8% faster than the single chip. All configurations did give a playable experience, however, with the 1% low for all configurations being around the mid-40s. The 2600K, however, absolutely walked all over them, scoring over double the FPS on both the average and 1% low scores. With nearly 100 million copies sold, it's time for GTA 5 next. Here I tested both in town and in the hills, using the very high quality settings with the exception for grass, and using 2x MSAA. Here scaling is much better, with the 4 core configuration scoring 40 FPS for the average and 24 FPS for the 1% low. It was playable but not very smooth. The 8 core configuration gained an impressive 25% over the single CPU to 50 FPS, and an enormous 42% improvement for the 1% low to 34 FPS. Overclocking had a relatively small impact, improving another 8% to a 54 FPS average, but was now in total 35% faster than the single chip. The Core i7 2600K was still a good bit faster, by 63%, scoring 88 FPS average. And last but not least, my personal favorite from the same year as SKULLTRAIL, the 2008 Grand Theft Auto 4. Here I drove a predetermined route through the city using the very high settings. Known for being poorly optimized, it might surprise you it gladly utilized all 8 threads. The single chip scored a 48 FPS average, but with a 26 FPS 1% low, it wasn't really smooth all the time. Moving to stock dual CPUs, the average improved by 13% to 54 FPS. Overclocking gained another 7% to 58 FPS, improving 21% over the single chip. However, the 1% low only improved by a single frame, resulting in a subpar experience from time to time still. Interestingly, the 2600K was a whopping 44% faster, with much better 1% low scores, showing that GTA 4 really thrives on faster single thread performance. So that was quite a lot of information. Time to analyze it and draw some conclusions out of it. Firstly, does the 8 core have an advantage over the 4 core now? Well, absolutely, every single game saw a performance improvement when going from 1 to 2 CPUs. On this graph you can see the average FPS of the single overclocked QX9775 versus the dual overclocked QX9775. On average, the 8-core system was 23% faster than the 4-core system. While not all games saw superb scaling, intensive titles as Battlefield 1, Crysis 3 and Grand Theft Auto 5 saw improvements from 35 up to 60%, which is a big gain, especially since this brought them all to around the 60 FPS level. Even when comparing the single overclocked QX9775 to the stock clocked dual CPU system, the lower clocked 8-core still has the upper hand. While certainly being closer than the overclocked 8 cores, there's still a big difference when looking at games like BF1, Crysis 3 and GTA 5, where those extra 4 cores really lift performance. Next, to what extent has overclocking helped? In theory it should have helped almost 21%, as that is the difference shown in Cinebench between stock and overclocked. However, in practice we only saw an average boost of 10% in frame rate, with Battlefield 1 gaining the most with 18% extra performance. While perhaps not unexpected, I would have hoped games to have seen improvements as great as Battlefield 1. As I predicted in my previous video, the system wasn't able to keep up with the 2600K. Without taking the extreme CSGO into consideration, it was 39% faster on average and was still held back by the GPU, as it maxed out GPU utilization in most games. SKULLTRAIL has enough potential CPU power, but the difference is likely down to lower single thread performance, the more outdated CPU architecture, and of course the side effects of combining 2 CPUs via a NOR bridge, all the while using weird fully buffered server memory. But at the end of the day, does that all really matter? Because after all, I'm really impressed with the results. After all, this is a highly complicated, dare I say experimental, decade-old system, which averaged 66 FPS over the 7 games I tested. And that is using very demanding quality settings, with a GPU which is much faster than what was available in 2008. And the fact that it managed to do that is more than enough for me. Well, that was all for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, as it took a lot of work to benchmark all the different configurations and to put this all together. If you did like it, a like would be very much appreciated. And if you have a comment, question, suggestion or anything along those lines, feel free to leave a comment or contact me on Twitter. If you want to stay updated on future projects, you can also subscribe to my channel. Well, that was it. Thanks for watching and bye bye.